Well, welcome to today's CJMD Spotlight. My name is Megan Jeffrey. I'm the Outreach Manager for the Department of Communication. It gives me great pleasure to see you all here. Before we start the formal event, I would just like to read a land acknowledgement that the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I'd now like to introduce the moderator for today's discussion, Adrian Russell. Adrian is the Mary Laird Wood Professor of Communication and co-director of the department's Center for Journalism, Media, and Democracy, or CJMD. Her research focuses on the digital age evolution of activist communication and journalism and explores communication related to climate change and social justice. She is editor, together with Matt Powers, of 2K, a special section of the journal Social Media and Society that is dedicated to public scholarship related to media and technology. Adrian, would you like to introduce our wonderful guest speaker, please?
Yes, thank you so much, Megan. It's such a pleasure. Welcome, everyone, to this Center for Journalism, Media, and Democracy Spotlight event on behalf of myself and the Center co-director, Matt Powers. It is such a pleasure to introduce Zizi Papacharissi, whose research has shaped our field, as you all know, in so many ways. Zizi is professor and head of the Department of Communication at University of Illinois at Chicago. She's founding editor of the top-ranked journal Social Media and Society, among many, many other things. But rather than list all of the things on her CV, I wanted to just briefly mention a few key ideas that she has contributed to our collective understanding of the social and political consequences of online media over the past few decades. It won't be a decades long worth of introduction. Don't worry, just a few key ideas. So just as the internet was becoming ubiquitous in the late 90s and early 2000s, her big picture theorizing of early online culture led her to consider how digital technologies influence our sense of self. Her early research documented how we tweak or remix ourselves to accommodate the various and overlapping groups we engage with online. This work helps scholars and people beyond the academy better understand what she termed our network selves. Zizi also, as I'm sure all of you know, has long been focused on the changing nature of publics. Her work on effective publics helps us understand the way today's publics use affect to engage both politically and socially. As she puts it, to feel their way into news issues and events, shaping narratives and at times invigorating dynamic public engagement. So she wrote about this in her book, Effective Publics, before Me Too, before Black Lives Matter, before less progressive movements that have emerged in recent years. But somehow she provides us a sort of theoretical blueprint to understand the political forces behind these movements and how emotions and politics and news mix in the digital era and to what effect. Most recently, Zizi has turned her attention to the questions about the state of democracy and what might come next. In her book, After Democracy, Imagining Our Political Future, Zizi takes the pulse of the current moment by combining historical and theoretical insights with the perspectives of citizens. One of the things I have always loved about Zizi's work is that she never shies away from hard questions. So I'm so excited to have her here today to talk about some of the hardest questions we're all thinking about and dealing with these days. And so the format will be that I have a few questions for Zizi, and if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll open it up and you can ask your questions yourself after maybe about 20 or 25 minutes. So welcome, Zizi. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Adrian, that was such a wonderful introduction. I mean, I think one of the better ones I've had, and one of the best ones ever I've had was by Katie Pierce, who I just saw here last time I visited the University of Washington, by foot to speak about effective public. So it's always great to join you. You're such wonderful and smart and engaging hosts, and I really look forward to having this conversation with you and with everyone. I look forward to talking about the the book with everyone. It's just one of my first opportunities to do so. The book just came out, so I've just started speaking about it.
So Zizi, will you begin by just sort of talking about the fruition of the book, like how you got the idea, and also how you, once you realized that you wanted to address the questions you do in the book, how you decided what approaches to take?
I'd be more than happy to. So the book is called After Democracy, and it does have just sort of a second part of the title. And I pause before saying that because I really dislike titles that are separated by double colons. I just prefer the title to be short. It would have been my preference if the title were After Democracy, but the full title is After Democracy, Imagining Our Political Future, which is not so bad. I mean, I like all of those words, imagining politics, future. That's what the book does. The press wanted things to be a little bit more specific. I wanted the title to be more like a mystery. I kind of thought it could be just sort of like, something that, potential readers could see and find intriguing and then be drawn to the book and open it up and try to unlock the mystery. But I think the press had a slightly more, pragmatic view, and they thought, hey, we would all be better off if we were just a little bit more specific right out front about what the book set out to do. So After Democracy, when you hear that, naturally that leads you to think that something has happened, like a major catastrophe, and maybe here I am, an anthropologist from the future, and there's digging through the ruins of democracy to figure out what happened. But it's not like that at all. I meant to write it as sort of like a detective story with a surprise happy ending. I wanted to write it to figure out not who killed democracy, but what happened that led democracy to the state that it is now, and what can be done about it. But that's not exactly where the idea for the book came from. I get my ideas in a couple of ways. Usually, I just get like a really interesting phrase in my head, and I grow it out into a book. Oh, there you go. You spotlighted me. Or I will start writing about something that's super interesting to me. And then in the course of writing about that, I'll come up with an interesting way to describe it. I like shorter titles, so things that are like no more than 2 or 3 words. This is why you have a networked self or a private sphere, and thank you for describing, a networked self so accurately and generously. A private sphere, effective publics, After Democracy. So After Democracy, it just popped in my head somehow as like a really cool phrase. And actually at first I would say After Democracy what? Because I got this quaint idea in my head that, we have so many ways of being, totalitarian or dictatorial or authoritarian or monarchical, or anyway, excluding people from governance. But when it comes to including people, 2 ways of governance, we just have one answer, and that's democracy. And that struck me as a little bit odd. How do we know? Where does it say that, democracy is the one and only way, and then also the best way to achieve equality, civic participation, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, and then safeguard all those things to communicate civic responsibility? Where is that written? And how do we know for sure that what we have is it, and it's the best way to get and to go after those things? It is something that we came up with, centuries and centuries ago, when we were very different people, lived very differently. It was conceived as something that many people were excluded from. So it wasn't, presented as something fully inclusive. And then since then, we've just kind of sort of retrofitted it and adjusted it. But, maybe we've grown out of it. In the book, I say, maybe it's, we've grown out of democracy, and it feels a little bit like, like we are trying to fit into the outfits, we wore as teenagers to try and look and feel cool again. And then I started thinking, what if democracy is not the final stop in our civic journey? What if there's like 1 or 2 or 3 or maybe 10 more stops in our civic journey as the human race, and technology can help us uncover those stops, build them out, in the same way that, railroads have helped us build out, the transportation system, reach out to different parts of the world, reach out to different people. And what if by using technology in this way, we can discover different aspects of who we are, different aspects of humanity, different aspects of how we could connect with people. So if there were such a next civic stop, what would it look like? And one last thing, unless, I hope I'm not giving you too lengthy of a response. People often assume because this book came out right after the Trump administration, I didn't know what was going to happen, when I wrote it. I didn't know that it was going to come out during a Biden administration. I didn't know that it was going to come out after a Capitol insurrection. I didn't know that people who would potentially have the option to buy my book and get like a COVID shot at the same time, a vaccination shot at the same time. I turned my book in before the pandemic and before things got crazy. I turned it in at the end of November 2019. I got the idea for it before the Trump administration. I got it by watching President Obama. I had just moved to Chicago in 2008, and when President Obama was elected, and he was already very popular and well known in Chicago. I mean, a lot of my colleagues knew him, had collaborated with him, spoke very highly of him. I support his politics, but I mean, that's irrelevant. He fascinates me as a political figure. But I was worried at the time that it's not that, I hadn't bought what he was selling. I was worried that this is not necessarily a bad thing, that the words that he was using, to speak with people, I was worried that they were too open and too vague, hope and change. I think they were very meaningful as messages. But I'm Greek, and I've heard those words before in Greek history, and they led down a very different path, even though they came from very promising and messianic political figures. But my primary concern, was that he just wasn't cut out for our time. I was worried that he would get to Washington, and Washington would not know what to do with him. For me, it felt like I was looking at a politician who had arrived from the future. I would, watch him speak, hear him speak, and I would think, well, I don't think we're ready for this. We don't know how to relate to this. We don't know how to read him. I think he says a lot of things, and we're interpreting him with just like a very dated syntax, a very dated way of understanding the world. We're not using what he's telling us and taking it and transforming it and deploying it in order to advance and progress to something better, something different. So these were my concerns, and then during his presidency, time and time again, I just kind of sort of watched him stumble into structures of democracy that were very dated, that belonged to a different universe, to a different time, to a different era, to a different society, to different people, that just didn't really represent and reflect who we are, who we were. and as a researcher, I spend a lot of my time talking to people about what they want out of democracy, what they want out of technology. And I hear a lot of enthusiasm, when I ask those questions. And I meet a lot of people who are very interested and intrigued and want to be involved, no matter what their political ideology might be. But I felt like, both we as a group, as a public, as publics, and also, the president that we had elected, Obama, we were just caught up in this sort of, self-reproducing weird loop of like dated and tired practices that were like boring to the public. So much of the public was tuning out. They were like semi-interesting to the press, and that were just really obstructive to Obama doing the sort of things that he wanted to do. And in many ways, they were just kind of getting in the way and setting up a pathway for his opponents to build, a polarizing divide. And we did see that happening. So to wrap up my response, I didn't, I didn't write this book because I was scared. I became scared, or I was concerned because of all the things that happened in the past 4 or 5 years, not just in the United States, but around the world, but rather because, I saw that, we had a lot of potentially many more gifted people who were being kept out of the political structure of governance because that structure just didn't know where to put them, and they didn't know how to fit in. And they kind of had to just sort of either sell out or substantially change themselves in order to fit in and somehow be able to function within that structure. Somewhere in my book, I say that, when this book comes out, there may likely be political strife and turbulence and riots. And I'm no oracle, but it just so happened that the book was published at the tail end of the Capitol insurrection at a very turbulent time in the United States. I don't know why I wrote that at the time. As I told you, I turned in the book well before all of this started unfolding. And as is my practice, when I wrap up a book, and I'm not sure exactly how to finish it, I go look at some art to get inspiration and to clear my head. So I took a trip and I went to some art exhibits that I wanted to see, and some new buildings in New York City. And then I came back and I wrote like the final few pages and turned the book in.
So I remember it must have been maybe 10 or more years ago, you and I were both at some conference, I think in Maryland, where we were both invited to talk about like breaking down like research questions, or like how to lead with your questions, not your methods, or something like that. I forget what it was, but we were both talking about how you can like piece together methods to actually answer questions that you want to know the answer to, rather than just picking the questions that you can answer. So I think it's really interesting about your work that, I think part of the reason why you often identify things before the rest of us know they're going to happen is because you do listen to people. All of your work is based on looking at people and citizens and online participants as valid, engagers in politics, at a time when there's a lot of derision about online participation and citizenship in general, and a lot of people that would have us blame people for what's going on. So can you talk a little bit about, so you have this big question, right? Like, what happened to democracy? What did you get out of talking to everyday people? Like, what were the insights that you didn't anticipate, but actually, that you couldn't have known without opening up your question to include everyday people from around the world?
First I want to say that I remember that conference very well. I think that's where we first met. And then I was involved in a little bit in helping the university design the conference and organize it. So I was very excited when you accepted their invitation to attend. I had been reading your work, some of the people that I was listening to and was getting inspired by were you. I wanted to meet you and have a conversation with you because of your work, network journalism, which I thought was ahead of its time and described many of the trends that I was looking at from a different perspective. I hope that you can still hear me. It says that my connection is unstable. All right. And then we were on a panel with Alf Hermida, and he was writing about this idea of ambient, always on media, platforms, publics. So it was the combination of those two influences, from you and this idea of networked journalism, of like interconnected publics, and then that we're always on in this ambient way that led me to affective publics. When we were presenting our work, it was one of the first times that I spoke about the research I was doing on Egypt. And I was a little bit, nervous and hesitant because I hadn't gotten comfortable with discussing that work in public. And I was, it's, as you do with every work, you kind of, first few times around, you look for the right terms to describe everything. So when you're speaking to a broad audience, they can understand what you're talking about. All right. Now, with this thing of traveling the world and talking to strangers, I think with every book, I think it's the greatest thing that I've ever done. And then I do something else, and I think that that's absolutely, tops what I've done before. It was a wonderful experience. I got the idea. I'm not the first person, who's done that sort of research. There's a few scholars whose work has inspired me. Michael Ignatieff, in particular, many others. I got the idea to try it myself while I was traveling the world and speaking about affective publics. I frequently found myself in situations where I just caught up in conversations with strangers, a taxi driver, a co-traveler on an airplane, somebody I would meet while at a conference. And of course, the minute that you say that you're a professor, and especially that you study social media, well, everybody has an opinion about social media and everybody's an expert, right? They want to tell you what they think and they think it's right, and all those things. So I thought, well, what if there was some way that I could just kind of systematically collect and interpret these conversations? And what if I could make this into a project? Then I got the idea, I'm sorry, I don't remember how I came up with the phrase after democracy and started thinking about, is there something better? Just kind of sort of appeared in my head, Mark Daisy told me once that, you have to think about something and read about it very intensely, and then you have to forget it and not think about it at all. And then that's when you have this like synapse and you get this idea, maybe that's what happened. So I got this idea and I thought, well, maybe I can do something really simple and fun and just do 3 questions, no more than that. And everybody gets the same 3 questions, but I'm not going to ask, people who I encounter in my I would specifically map this and plan this so that I could cross paths with people who I would never normally encounter. So I spent some time thinking about this and how I could do that and how I could use my networks to then jump out and leap out to other networks that I would not normally interact with, and really, select with strangers, and how I could first, approach them and not be like, hello, what is democracy? But engage them in general conversation, feel them out, get a sense for their profession in politics because I wanted my sample to be diverse, and have have these conversations. I thought about it for some time. I mapped it out. I played it out in my head. I rehearsed it. And one day I was traveling I was in Mexico City for a talk, and I got into a taxi to go to a TV station to do an interview. And I ran into a very chatty cab driver. That's one of the stories I start the book with, Lewis. And he asked me what I do and where I'm headed and why I'm going to that TV station. And after we started chatting, I was like, well, here you go, Zizi. I had like a little bit of butterflies in the stomach and trepidation of, here we go, just go for it. I had my IRB approval. I was like, this is going to be patient number 0. And I asked him, I said, do you mind, I'm working on this project. What do you think? And he was just, it was a joy. It went so well. And there was a whole rhythm to it because there was traffic and there was heat and there was noise. And the whole thing was a metaphor for what we're going through and what I was as democratic publics and what I was trying to do. And honking. And of course, he was very lively and he had opinions and he gave me great quotes. And I had a system where sometimes I recorded if they allowed me, and sometimes I took notes. Sometimes I was able to do both, and then also I read them back their quotes because I was never going to see them again. I wanted to make sure that they were okay with me quoting them. So I put all that into work, and then that's how I started.
And what did you learn, like, if you think about it collectively, because I know you were talking to citizens or members of the public from different sorts of democracies, so failed democracies, I think, what were the other categories? Successful democracies and like sort of struggling democracies, right? And so like, what would you say that you found out about how people view being citizens in this era? And how it overlaps with some of the technological themes that have been the center of your work in the past.
Yeah, so it was really striking how similar the responses were. I mean, I did 100 interviews, but I, reached redundancy well before that. At some point, I just kept on doing interviews just to make sure that I wasn't missing anything, but it wasn't really adding anything to the sample. When it came to citizenship, there were 2 trends that were dominant. The first one is, and I talk about it in the book as this idea of the noble citizen. So there's this nobility that comes out in people when you talk to them about being a citizen. What is your civic responsibility? What do you want to do? What is your aspirationally, how do you view yourself contributing to democracy? So they all told me very, very noble things. Idealistic things, whether they were like far left or far right. I did not hear one wrong thing. And I can't say because, we could say, is there like a social desirability issue going on here? Yes, to a certain extent there is, it's a learned thing. When we're socialized into learning what democracy is, we learn to use a certain vocabulary. I talk about that in the book. I talk about the fact that, when I first talk to people, they give me scripted responses. It's part of the social desirability aspect. It's part of what we learn. But then as we talk more, they loosen up and they start using examples. And that's where the more interesting stuff comes out, as many people know who have done interviews. So, the more I pressed on, they would tell me stories about, because I would ask, I would follow up with, well, when was it? Describe a time that you did something as a citizen that you found very fulfilling, and they just told me stories of like great nobility and contribution to the community, to the neighborhood, like things that we all really associated with being a citizen. So that was the one core trend. The second one, it was like, strangely, there was no room in any democratic system or society to count that as citizenship. So it was almost like these things were invisible to politicians. And then I talk about, the invisible citizen who contributes in so many ways, but is only seen and actually counted when they go to vote in election. That happens only every few years. And that's really not often enough for a person to feel that they're contributing to their society, to their democracy, to their country in a meaningful way. Most of them said that the experiences that they found super meaningful had to do with working in micro communities, micro organizations, all things that are completely excluded out of like the everyday structures, routine, the habitus of democratic governance.
Okay, so I want to open this up to questions from everyone who's here today, because I know people have questions, but I just want to ask one more question, and then, I'll jump.
I have extra time if you want to stay too,
okay,
so it's
great.
really okay.
I'm realizing this hour is going by very fast, but I want to, so I know that the finding about micro communities and acts of democracy is part of, you talk about this in the end of your book when you write about recommendations. And I wanted to ask you two things about the final chapter. One is if you will talk a little bit, like just highlight a few key recommendations that you take from this research that you wrote about. And also, I know that we have a lot of graduate students that are here in attendance today. And I think one question that we all have as scholars are, to what extent do we translate our research into some form of engagement, or a set of recommendations, or reach beyond the academy. And so my other question is just like, how do you decide when and how to make these recommendations, just in your work more generally? So first question, a few highlights of the recommendations. Second, like, what's the deal with recommendations when you're an academic? Like, when to do it, like how to do it, and that sort of thing.
Okay, I'm just going to share a couple of slides so that it's easier to see the recommendations.
But it was actually just a screen share.
Yeah, so this is the artwork is by Virgil Abloh, and it says you're obviously in the wrong place, and I include that here because if it feels like it's speaking to every citizen, you're obviously in the wrong place because where you are, nobody's listening. But the recommendations that I have are here, and then here the artwork is by artist and performance artist Robert Montgomery. He has this installation. It's actually, he just superimposes words on weird locations and streets. So here he created this: the future is an invisible playground, which I would have used in the book, but I discovered it after, and I think he did it after as well. These are the 10 recommendations that I make. I'm not sure, are you able to see them all, or just, okay, good, because I'm only able to see up to 9. Oh, there we go. I had something obscuring that. It's very important for me to make the recommendations. Otherwise, there's no, I felt like there's no point to the book, like, well, why am I pulling these stories together? How do we take this forward? If I set out looking for what might follow democracy, how do we get there? None of the people actually wanted to tell me that, they wanted to abandon democracy. They were more interested in fixing it. So I came up with these recommendations by pulling together their stories. And then in the end, I talk about what might possibly follow democracy if we understand both democracy and technology, both the objectives of democracy and technology better. I think if we're able to do that as a human race, I think we will evolve to the next stage of what we can possibly be as citizens. But it'll be something that involves a very different understanding and use of technology than what we are accustomed to. We mostly use technology to reinforce and reproduce our daily habits. I'm talking about using it to just really reinvent ourselves radically. So That's for a response to, another question. These are the 10 recommendations. I want to talk about this one. You might recognize this one, Adrian. I got the idea when I wrote something for you. This idea of forgetting messiahs. I think that we've read a lot and we've studied a lot as researchers. What media do, what publicness does to people, to politicians. It's very difficult, to appear on TV and come across as authentic. I mean, think of yourselves, when you have to go on Zoom, in front of your students. It's not something that you're accustomed to doing every day. For most politicians, it's very easy to appear as caricatures of themselves online or on television. I write in the book that if you're a politician, in order to appear yourself, you have to play a particular part. In order to come across as authentic, you have to play a particular character of yourself being authentic. You have to choose an aspect of your personality and overperform it. But that's unfortunate, but it is what you end up doing. Think about how President Obama had to tone down or change his demeanor after the first public debate that he did during the 2008 presidential election. He had to, in some ways, not be himself in order to come across and be read as who he was correctly. He had to redact his own performance, if you will. I am deeply suspicious and distrustful of people who are naturally and effortlessly good and solid and authentic on TV. So I think there's really something quite strange about the fact that President Trump was effortlessly good at utilizing media that most politicians had failed at.
Yeah.
So I think we have a tendency to, have bloated expectations of our politicians. We want to be able to do all these things with them. We want them to run the country, but we also want them to be the person that we can have beers with. Well, and also relate to them like we relate to our next door neighbor. Well, you don't vote your next door neighbor into office, and if you thought about that idea, you think it ridiculous. And there's a reason for that. So I think we need to reevaluate our own understanding and our ways of reading these politicians and the criteria that we use in voting them into office. And also stop looking for people to solve our problems. It's a ridiculous, insane thing when you think about it. It does not exist a single person who's going to be able to solve everyone's problem. Does not exist. There's no such thing out there. Perhaps, in outer space, there's an alien who can do that, but not on Earth. Mm-hmm. So we have to understand that and there's all transhuman democracy. It could happen in the future. So we have to be, strategic about what our problems are. We have to set, long-term and short-term goals, and we have to prioritize them and decide that, maybe who we vote into the office is not going to be, the most popular and the most likable. I think we have this syndrome from high school when we were voting for prom queen. That's not who we're voting for. We're voting for the most capable person. Sorry to say, the most capable person is often a very boring person too. We're not voting them, for entertainment value. We're voting them again into office based on merit.
So that's a very American reference, Zizi. Do they really have proms in Greece? Okay, let's open it up. And there's a question there's a bunch of questions in the chat, but I want to relay this one from Matt, who's asking, can you say more about reinventing journalism? Does it look similar around the world, or how do you view that? the reinvention of journalism? Just a small question.
Yeah, so it obviously varies around the world. And, something that the rest of the world does different is that they're not fixated on this obsession with objectivity that we have here in the US. And they don't read objectivity in the same way, but they're also limited. So the press is more openly partisan, as we know in many other countries. And there's obviously wrong things with that, but at the same time, publics are accustomed to that partisanship, so that they know when they read a paper that they're reading partisan news. So they are processing that in a different way. They have accomplished a different kind of literacy. I'm not saying that that's a perfect or an ideal news environment, but it's something quite different that we could learn from, not imitate wholly, just employ elements from that. I think there's activist elements that you speak about, Adrian, in your work that could be very useful. And by activism, I don't mean like the same kind of activism of, we're going out into the streets. I mean a different kind of more long-term strategic activism of making the world a better place. In the United States, we're caught up in this objectivity dogma, where not only does that limit how we tell stories, but it also comes with the assumption that, in order to be objective, you have to tell both sides of the story, which is a flawed assumption. No story has only two sides. There's some stories that have only one side. There's stories that have multiple sides. So you have to be inclusive of all viewpoints. And you have to find ways to tell stories that are interesting, engaging, but also do not go through the process of casting everyone into a character and in order to create drama so as to achieve ratings or meet the standards of, the economics of attention. So that's part of what I mean by saying reinventing journalism. Obviously, it's a business, somebody has to pay the bill. So, somebody has to pay these people. So they need to produce things that are going to be read. But I think we can find a way to tell interesting stories without completely turning everything into clickbait and a soap opera, especially when it comes to politics.
Okay, thank you. Okay, everybody can unmute themselves and ask a question if they like. There's also some questions accumulating in the chat, which I'm getting behind on. So if somebody wants to ask their question while I catch up, that would be great. Okay, we have a question from Christine that says, what do you think the relationship between successful democratic governance / participation and extreme economic disparities?
Wait a minute. What was that? And can you repeat that again? Because I was also reading some of the other questions.
What do you think? I know it's a little.
There's okay, I found it. And extreme economic disparities. That relationship is everything. I mean, I'll tell you a story that illustrates that point. When I interviewed refugees for this book from a variety of different countries, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Egypt, Tunisia, to name a few. And it was a humbling experience talking with them. How do you ask someone who left their country with just the clothes on their back, because if they stayed, they were going to be recruited by the Taliban. And if they refused to be recruited by the Taliban, well, then their family were going to be kidnapped, killed, all those terrible, terrible things, tortured. How do you ask that person, what is democracy? What does it mean to be a citizenship? I was humbled by the responses that I got by those people. Obviously, the first thing that they talked about is, you have to start from a place of stability. And they didn't even, they talked about economic stability, but they also talked about political stability, because I think you have to understand, and, there's such an element of American exceptionalism when we talk about democracy, and when we also interpret our own experiences. These things happen to us and we think that they're the most horrible things and that they've only happened to us, and nobody has experienced, similar things. And oh my God, what's going to happen to us? So despite all of the difficulties that these people had encountered, when I asked, about democracy, they talked about stability, political stability, so that they could build their own economic security on top of that. So this idea, because so many people exist and come from countries where one day it's one government, and then you literally don't know what sort of, political day is going to dawn for you. You wake up and things could be radically different. That's something very foreign to us. For many of us, I should say, we haven't experienced it. So what they longed for was political stability, but they fully understood that, these spheres are interconnected. You can't separate economics from politics. The reason why political stability could not happen was because there was economic corruption. So they spoke about both of those things. It's fundamental. This is why I write about, soft capitalism, strong democracy, because I think at present we're operating under strong, fully blown out capitalism everywhere, and soft democracy, where democracy is just sort of, the person in the room who's saying, oh, am I in the way? Do you need should I get out of your hair so you could go buy some more companies and do what you need to do? And it should really be the other way around. We should find ways, to utilize the benefits that capitalism can afford to advance, to enhance democracy. It's not difficult and it's not impossible. It takes time and it takes perseverance. It takes setting long-term and then also short-term goals. As I frequently say, change is gradual, revolutions are long. So we have to learn as citizens. I say one of the other recommendations is be our own civic agents of change. I make the argument that we have to sort of, outgrow this, teenage impatience that we have for everything to just, change within a couple of years. It's impossible to break habits that we've had for centuries within such a short time frame. But if we are persistent, we can make a difference.
Great, thank you. Who wants to ask a question?
You're welcome to come off mute, or if you raise your hand, I can call on you.
I'm trying to get people to speak up rather than...
Have I read? Oh, is it Leah?
Leah.
Yeah, I haven't read Ralph's book yet, but I do know Ralph quite well. We collaborate on a number of projects. I understand, I'm familiar with his perspective. It's his approach is slightly different from mine, but we agree on a lot of different things. So I will read it as soon as I have a minute with a lot of interest. Thank you for that recommendation. I read some of his other work and I've had many conversations with him though. So I suspect, yeah.
Yeah, it's I haven't read your book yet, although I have it now and I'm excited to read it. I have read his, and it sounds from what you said today very similar.
Yeah.
And
he does take a rhetorical approach. That's what he does. So he sees that, but he's a seasoned scholar. He's very smart. I've known him since I've been at UIC for 12 years now. So, and I look forward to taking a look at it. I don't know how I missed it, but thank you for bringing it to my attention. Maybe we'll trade copies. I'll give him mine. He'll give me his.
I'd be happy just to ask a quick follow-up about soft capitalism, which you had mentioned, which was a question I'd put in the chat. It sort of seems like historically, like liberal democracy, as we understand it from like the 18th century forward, has the capacity to, was like really born with the growth of capitalism itself, and has since basically been able to foster capitalist liberal democracies and fascism in like the mass party sense, not in like the liberal understanding of Trump, but in like the really like the mass base of fascism. And I'm curious whether you think that there is another form of like political organization that capitalism can actually foster that goes beyond something in a way that we would actually like want to see. Because I'm feeling there just seems to be so much tension between the way that capitalism presents what citizenship is in the sense of a equality through the law rather than exposure to really unequal market conditions.
Yeah. So that's an excellent question. You're absolutely right in everything and every single point that you make. When I say soft capitalism, I'll give you some examples of things that could happen that might just, make for a capitalism that is just a little bit more democracy friendly. I think there could be a social welfare component to the most capitalist models that would be better articulated. We lost that, and we completely forgot about it with the 2008 financial crisis. And when I say we, I don't mean just in the United States. I mean primarily within the European Union. And I also mean in terms of how the more powerful countries connect to the less privileged countries. So there is that component of social welfare that needs to then find its place again because we've completely forgotten about it. And a very recent example of that is that, in the midst of the pandemic, in so many countries, we were so preoccupied with, what's going to happen to all the businesses, what's going to happen to all the restaurants, what's going to happen to the hair salons, and what's going to happen to all the, the mani-pedi places. But nobody asked, how about we put off opening the restaurants so we can open the schools first? Because getting your degree on time is going to allow you to get a job. And how about, creating a different set of jobs that are specific to the pandemic so that we can sustain the economy and keep going forward? So this is what I mean when I say so much of our way of thinking is caught up at just practicing and doing over the same things that we feel very comfortable doing. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, kill your favorite restaurant, but I just think it's really quite striking that we went to a lot of effort and social distance. And, the primary motivation for that was so that we can reopen business and not so that we can sustain a future for our children. So that's one example. The second example is that, there's economic cycles. And I'm not an economist, by the way. I just have 1 degree in economics. So my responses are going to be limited, but there are, in the process of writing about soft capitalism, I spoke with a few economists who speak about these things in a much more sophisticated manner. But what I want to talk about is, there are financial cycles, of course. Things are not always going to be reasonable. However, in the past 10 years, these financial cycles tend to repeat themselves a little bit more often. And we've created a stock market that sort of, that functions on producing, reproducing, and reinforcing bubbles. There's some companies that should be in the stock market, should trade there because they produce a product. And then there are some companies that have no business being there. There's people who are able to game that system. And I think we saw a very interesting example of that with GameStop recently. But we also saw, what ultra gaming can lead to. But I think what we need to take away from that entire story is not that, we need to regulate the stock market, but that we have a flawed stock market that overemphasizes expectation and evaluation that's very subjective. and then discards actual value. And for more on this, I would point you to the work of Daniel Kahneman, who's written extensively about that, especially in his book, Thinking Slow and Fast.
Anyone else want to come off mute and ask a question, or I'm welcome to read one from the chat?
Hi, Zizi.
Hi.
Thanks for being here. I have a question that comes from my longtime frustration as a politics journalist, and the reluctance or incompetence over the last 2 decades of government to accept that, in effect, the government is internet. It is digital communications now. And I feel like I wrote a story in like 1997 about how Congress was afraid of email, because if you respond, then you have to it just brings more email. And I feel like, this weekend I tried to get a vaccination, and like, if it's all about like refreshing your screen on your phone and stuff like that. And, if you're over a certain age, you're not going to get a vaccination if you don't have a good internet connection, et cetera. But I'm just keep thinking about how the government's lack of fully accepting that digital communication is now the touch point of public interest and public service. And it's how people think of their relationship with government and its efficiency. And I think that lack of really accepting, you think about like the caucuses in Iowa and how that experiment completely failed because of a bad interface. The Affordable Care Act, it failed. Why? Because of a bad interface, bad digital connection with the public. And then you see QAnon, those kind of groups, which are fueled, they live on the digital communications that they think is their own public sphere, and that I think that they think about as their government, their connection to government now. So I don't know, I was just thinking, what do you think about the QAnon kind of phenomenon and the intersection of politics, public interest, democracy, and digital communications?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you were talking about it, I was reading also what you wrote in the chat box. Look, obviously we have a problem with the truth, and it's put, journalists in a really difficult position that I don't really envy, because, they were not trained to defend the truth. They were trained to find the truth, to do some detective work and then to report it, to tell it in an interesting way. But to defend it, that's the job of the scientists, right? We present, we look for the truth, we present it, we substantiate it, we share it with the world. But then, we work together with journalists in presenting that to everyone. So we obviously have a problem with the truth. And it has to do with the fact that the infrastructure of truth has been substantially damaged over the past 5 years in the United States in ways that are very new to us, but in ways that sound very familiar to other countries. It's little truth experiments that, dictators have conducted on the truth, may ring all too familiar to people who grew up in different countries or who live in different countries. My thinking on QAnon and this, this whole subset of an alternate reality that they subscribe to, I think that illustrates that, one of our colleagues in communication, Terry Flew, gave an ICA presidential address where he said, the truth is no longer enough. And I believe that, because the truth is not on its own. It's just simply not enough anymore. Why is that? My belief is, and there's research to support this, that the truth is more than, what is out there, a reality. It's a mechanism for belonging. It's an effective mechanism for belonging. right? We choose to believe the truths that we feel comfortable belonging in, the truths that help us feel secure. And at times of heightened insecurity, we're even more likely to subscribe to those truths that are not going to conflict with our understanding of reality, our way of doing things. I do think that right now we're going through a period of heightened insecurity. Of course, we're in a pandemic, and the way in which the manner in which the pandemic has been dealt with, has led us to the situations that you describe, where you just, your best chance of getting an appointment is hitting the refresh button. I think if, the United States is a massive enterprise, is a massive machine of innovation, and it was so slow to respond, so slow to put its scientists to work. I mean, if only we had all of our scientists communicating and collaborating much more effectively, we would have led the way out of this. We would have been way ahead of this by now, but we weren't able to, for reasons that we're all too familiar with. Still, I think, and this QAnon phenomenon, I think we think of it as a very strange thing, as a very foreign thing. But we have to understand that choosing to believe the truths that are comfortable for us is not such an unfamiliar experience. I think that's something that we do in our everyday lives. In our relationships, we choose to see certain things and not see other things. In how we vote politicians into office, we focus, we spotlight certain behaviors, we ignore others. So obviously, yes, I mean, QAnon has taken it to a very different level here. They've next level the heck out of this, but it's not such an unfamiliar trend. And I think there's a way to reach out to those people by understanding that what they're trying to do is to find a mechanism for belonging. But then also, but we also have to be strict. So there's a combination of softness in the sense that we have to show understanding, but we also have to be strict. So if, your understanding of reality and your need to belong somewhere is just so misaligned with what greater society has set out as fundamental values and perspectives, then there's no reason for you to be included in there. So it is a thin line, of course, because QAnon tends to use rhetoric very sharply in order to dance around that thin line. But I will say that we've had similar problems in other countries where people, politically affiliated people that have an ideology, do try, subscribe to a different reality and try to advocate it. What we do with those people in Greece, for instance, we take them to the DA. So in the case of, the COVID-19 pandemic, there were many sites on Facebook that were spreading misinformation. They were prosecuted. They were taking the DA. I mean, I'm not telling you that these people are, serving long-term sentences in prison, but they were prosecuted. And I think that communicates something as a society that, yes, we're going to take a soft approach. We're going to give you an opportunity to explain things. But if you are spreading information that is incorrect, then we're going to treat that similar to how we treat libel, how we treat defamation. And we're going to show you that we address it, that we're not just going to ignore it and call it, free speech. It's not free speech.
Okay, so we're going over time. I hope that's okay. It seems like we're still, let's just take a few more minutes for last questions that anyone wants to ask. There are a lot in the chat. I can also, I think we're not lacking for questions. It's just.
Hey, Jen Kim, there is no country that I think is a model for the future. I thought that I was going to find that in Canada, And then when I traveled there and did interviews, same problems over there. So that question has been answered. I said, Caleb, to everyone, you don't get to vote. Yes, there are absolutely fixes. And there's distinctions that should be made between, Caleb is asking, to your point, you don't vote your neighbor into office. Do these suggestions work at all levels, or are these fixes, takeaways focused only on regional, national level democracy? For example, is there a difference in the processes and fixes at the city county level versus the state and national? Yes, absolutely. I write about that in the book. I make the point that, the 10 recommendations that I make, they all work together. You can't adopt one and then forget about the other 9. You just kind of have to implement them all together. So once you set long-term versus short-term goals, then you have to work with micro groups and micro organizations, meso-level organizations, and then macro-level organizations, and have communication channels that connect them. I think this requires training a whole set of new professionals who are trained to do that. Civic agents for democracy. I mean, this could be a way of creating a whole subset of new jobs. This is what I mean when I'm talking about reimagining how we do things, not reinforcing, repeating, reproducing the same kinds of professions. We need civic agents for democracies. Who are they? What is their role? The role has to be to connect people in these societies that have become so mass that it's very easy to become disconnected and therefore polarized. Obviously, there are some solutions that are going to work on the smaller level. There are going to be some solutions that are going to be more appropriate on the meso level. But if we have these people serving as conduits in between who are trained to do that, for instance, we could offer a BA for people whose job it is to be a civic agent of connection. They could have some background in the humanities. They could have some background in political science. It would be great also if they have some background in information science and the library sciences. We could offer another BA for what I would call information curators. They are the librarians of the modern age, because that is one of the things the internet is, a library for everyone. So these curators could have some background in communication, background in the humanities, background again in information science, can be hired by Facebook, by Twitter, to monitor and moderate these conversations, to look at what's happening, so that we don't have things like there's an IA and an AI reading a conversation that's talking about how to make a chess move, and reading that as a conversation that's potentially racist. That's something that an example I took from the news today. If there is an updated edition after democracy already, young fun, all right.
Your work is never done, Zizi.
What our experience would add to your book, given that prototypical democracies such as US, UK, France, Italy, India, Brazil are among the countries that suffer the gravest human casualties and fail to provide citizens with necessary protection and information. Same set of recommendations. I write my books with a little bit of air. I like for these recommendations to stand the test of time. I can tell you, I could rethink this again in a year and come up with something different. And if that happens, I'll either do an updated edition, but I'll probably just write a shorter article.
Thank you so much. I hope everybody gets the book and reads it. And, I know it's probably most people haven't had a chance to read any of it yet, but this is such a great overview, and it's such a pleasure to have you here and have this conversation. Appreciate it so much.
Thank you. And this has been so much fun. Thank you for being so generous with your questions, with sharing your thoughts, so generous with your time. Feel free to reach out. I look forward to hearing from all of you. I thoroughly enjoyed this. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with you.